So this video I'm going to take you through goes over why rebellions happen, and it lists it out as a process, a pattern basically, that follows 5 distinct stages. And most rebellions happen this way, so if you understand this pattern, you can understand Catalan and Democ, you can understand the American Revolution, you can really understand why things play out the way they do overall on the basic level. The names will change, the places will change, the reasons will change, but how rebellions play out really doesn't change all that much as far as the story they all follow. There's a pattern I'm going to show you, and it's a 5-part pattern. So first of all, it is a process. Rebellions take time to develop. They don't happen overnight. No one wakes up in the morning and decides they're going to just overthrow the government and start a rebellion. It's a process of things that add up to the point where a rebellion takes place. And most of the time, they don't get very far. There's always problems in life between people and government that cause issues. And people are generally, often, discontent sometimes with things that the government does. However, they don't usually turn into big problems. It's only if they aren't solved at the beginning that things can develop, accelerate, and then potentially explode. Hopefully after that, some resolution will happen. Something will happen that will finalize it so we don't keep doing this over and over again. So what I'll do is I'll explain every step to you and what happens really at every situation, every step. So, the first stage is creatively called the beginning stage. I didn't spend a whole lot of time kind of thinking up fancy names for each stage. I wanted to be obvious. So, the beginning stage, things start innocently enough. A lot of times in rebellions, people don't expect that a rebellion or revolution can ever happen in the place that they live. People think it would never happen here. That's other countries we hear about. Not here, not us. But they can start in peaceful places. In fact, they usually do start in peaceful societies. All nations, all societies have problems, but most of those times, those problems can be resolved. They have a solution for the most part, but usually those solutions are either hard to find, but oftentimes in the beginning, you can usually stop them before they really get all that far. But if a serious issue comes up that divides people into two sides, that's when you might have an issue. So common issues that can divide people would be taxes, for example. Government spending money a certain way that people don't like, or people believing they're paying too much money to the government they shouldn't have to pay. Or one with the American Revolution, people paying into the government but having no voice in that government at all as far as what that money's used for, how they spend that money. Religion can sometimes cause dividing issues as it has in different places across the world. Human rights is an issue that can divide people. It's got to be a serious issue that people care very strongly about. And if one comes up and there's no immediate solution, oftentimes you get people dividing into 2 or sometimes more separate sides. To keep it simple for now, we'll kind of have 2 sides to this, but there can be more complicated rebellions where there's more than 2 sides. Catalan and Democ was sort of like that, with your rebels, your government as far as President Alexei was concerned, and even those merchants, those loyalists who lived among us in Catalan, they were a third side that we kind of overlooked sometimes during this game. So you have these issues kind of bring up and come up, and the government's always on one side of it. At least much of the government's on one side. And on the other side, you've got a significant number of people who complain about the government's policies. So there's your 2 sides for sure. Let's again keep it simple and look at this as a 2-sided rebellion. The government versus the people who want to change the government and feel the government's taking them in a direction and making decisions the people just don't like. At the beginning, usually you can solve the problem peacefully. Oftentimes, the government has solutions. Compromises can be reached. If you look at the Catalan and Democ situation, if you go back 10 years or so, there were some compromises that got brought up by Catalan that got rejected by the people of Democ. But there were some potential solutions there. At that stage, you can solve the problem peacefully. And if you do, problem solved, it never gets beyond stage 1. You have the seeds of rebellion, but it never takes fruit, meaning it never grows from there because the problem gets solved by compromise or by some sort of solution peacefully. But if you want to have a situation escalate and get worse, the problem is dealt with, yes, but it's dealt with in a way that makes the situation even worse. And not dealing with it at all oftentimes is one of the ways the situation gets worse. So when it gets worse, we move into stage 2, which is the development stage. And that's when people start to get frustrated because there's a problem that they believe there might have been a solution to on their side, and it just didn't work, that it didn't set in. And the 2 sides then start to do this. They blame each other for the problem not being solved. I should have gone and found the Spider-Man meme. I had this earlier and didn't go and make a brand new presentation for it, but I made it at first before that very famous meme kind of started becoming very popular on the internet. But if you picture that in your mind or this picture, you kind of know what's going on here. People are blaming each other. The fact that the problem's not being solved becomes their fault because they're not doing things the right way. Again, look at the situation here. The wall is what started the problem between Catalin and DeMock. DeMock felt that Catalin should have helped pay for the wall as they were part of the country. Catalin believed that the wall really didn't benefit them and paying an equal share didn't make a lot of sense. And when they came up with solutions, they were rejected. Well, DeMock might have said those solutions really aren't necessary. We're all a team, pay for the wall. Both sides started to blame each other for the problem getting worse and worse. So a major symptom of stage 2, the development stage, is absolutely blame. When you start to see this happen, and it's gone beyond, hey, there's a problem, let's look to stop it, when the blame game gets played, now you're looking at stage 2 for a rebellion. And the longer that goes on, the more the two sides start to get very stuck on their ideas and set in their ways. Compromise now becomes very hard to do because you start looking at the other side as the enemy, not a person with whom you disagree. That was stage 1. At stage 2, the other side becomes the unreasonable enemy that just won't do the right thing. Of course, there's two sides, and they both regard each other and see each other that way. And what this means is compromise now, it's still possible, but it gets a lot more and more unlikely. It's less likely to happen because people to compromise have to find some common ground. And the more that resentment and that blame builds up, the more that people don't want to find that common ground, and they don't want to even deal with the other side. We certainly saw that in Catalin and DeMock between the rebels and President Alexei. Neither side was willing even to sit down and talk to each other. And if that's the case, good luck ever finding a compromise. That is clearly something that you see start to happen at stage 2. And speaking of rebel groups, you have rebel groups forming at stage 2. That's an obvious symptom of a stage 2 rebellion is you have rebel groups getting formed. Now, rebel groups start to loudly and kind of obviously protest, and they use some emotional appeals, anger a lot, to kind of show people that they're not very happy with the way this whole situation is going. They don't always use violence. At stage 2, the rebel groups are not always violent. But that doesn't mean they won't be violent. And violence means different things to different people. Violence, of course, is obvious if people are getting shot and killed. That's violence. But sometimes violence takes on, as we saw in the game, a less obvious form. Violence doesn't always hurt people. For example, the arson in our game with Catalin and DeMock was certainly a violent act. The riot that took place was a violent act where both sides blamed each other. No one got killed in either of those situations. How about throwing bricks through windows and just bullying and intimidating people? Violent acts, right? So those certainly happen at this point, but they don't have to happen. Sometimes it's just rhetorical, meaning it's just people talking, writing, sharing their points of view, yes, in a very forceful way, and yes, criticizing the government. But it isn't always violent at stage 2. So if you're looking at stage 2 and seeing a rebel group form, whether that rebel group is violent or not violent, if they're starting to get kind of loud and angry and really visible, you probably have a stage 2 rebellion brewing on your hands. And if they're violent, well, yeah, certainly you've got a stage 2 rebellion brewing on your hands. And what this does, is that at stage 2, rebels start to make some converts. When stage 2 starts to get bigger, it means the rebel group is starting to convince people that they have a solid point. Now, if that doesn't happen, you probably end it right there. But at stage 2, if it really grows and develops, as it did in our Catalin and DeMock game, people are starting to understand and agree with the rebels' points. That doesn't mean the rebels' points are always the right side. Sometimes the rebels make points and use propaganda. They kind of spin their story their way to make it seem like they're the good guys. It's very effective. And their violence is effective as well. We saw it in the game, where people just kind of sit back and they will say that they support the rebels, even if they don't, just because they don't want to be targeted by the rebels. Violence is not a very nice tactic, but unfortunately sometimes it can be very effective. So the rebel group's growing. When you see that happen, you have a stage 2 rebellion. And when they gain strength, even if their points are good or bad. It adds to the potential problem because now that vocal group standing up and saying the government is wrong is now bigger and stronger, and governments don't tend to like being told, especially forcefully, that they are wrong. Now, at stage 3, things will start to heat up and go from bad to worse quickly. At stage 3, what that means is something big will take place that shows that the problem has worsened. I call that a bridge event because it's the bridge that takes you from stage 2 to stage 3. Now, I'm not sure what the bridge event would have been in Catalin de Moc. Maybe it was the fire. Maybe it was the riot that took place. Maybe it was the president sending the military to Catalin. Or maybe it was something that happened during your game. And every game of our 5 groups here was very different, so I'm not sure what would have happened in a specific class to mention here in this video I'm making for all of us. But stage 3 might have actually happened during the game itself. You might have inherited the game at stage 2, and stage 3 occurred while we were playing. But a big thing is there's got to be some sort of bridge event, something big that takes us from stage 2 to stage 3, and now stuff starts to happen faster, and it gets more dangerous. You also see propaganda big time at this stage. Propaganda, I've used that term early in this video. If you don't know what it is, I'll define it for you now. I probably should have defined it for you then, but I'll define it for you now. Propaganda is basically biased news, where people who have an agenda, where people who have an idea, people who want you to believe things their way, will tell you things. And it may be true, but the way they tell it makes them seem to be the good guys, and the other side seem to be the bad guys. Sometimes they're lying outright. Sometimes they're just telling you stories that aren't true for propaganda. Sometimes they're telling you the truth but leaving out parts that will be very important to show, hey, maybe it's not quite what they're telling me. But propaganda is a very powerful tool. Both the government and the rebels will use propaganda, and the idea is to show that the other side, they're the bad guys. They're the ones that are causing the problem. They're the ones ripping the country apart. The goal in propaganda is to make you like the person who's creating the propaganda and dislike the other side. And if you start seeing a lot of this, you're probably at stage 3. At the very least, you're in the late stages of stage 2. But if you start to see more and more propaganda, you're at the acceleration phase, and people's minds are going to be changed and made up, and folks will choose sides. At stage 3, the government starts to be more forceful. They start to crack down on the rebels. The idea here is the government will try to scare the rebels by showing the government's force. The government's always bigger than the rebels are, and usually stronger when it comes to the types of weapons they have and their military. And they hope sometimes by flexing that military muscle that they can get the rebels to back down and think, all right, maybe we shouldn't keep rebelling here. Do we really want to fight against that powerful army? We saw that in our game. That was President Alexei's whole philosophy. I'll send the army to Catalin. The rebels will back down because they won't want to challenge that military. They want to scare the rebels into giving up. The problem is that doesn't always happen. Sometimes it does. There are times the rebel groups will back down. And if that happens, then maybe you can now start working toward a peaceful solution because maybe the rebels now will be willing to compromise. But oftentimes the opposite happens, as happened in Catalin. It just makes the rebels fight harder. And that's the problem you get into when you use force like this. Rebel groups resist the government. And the harsher the government is, more and more people start to see the government as the problem, as they did in Catalin. The harsher the groups were, the groups in our game who used martial law, who really cracked down and arrested the rebels and locked them up and did surprise searches and used curfews, that martial law, in every situation there, it made the rebel numbers go way higher. That's because people start to see the government as abusive. And if the rebel point all along is the government are the bad guys, they're the abusive ones, we're right and they're wrong, the government cracking down too harshly often proves the rebels' point, and people say, aha, I see what the rebels are saying now. I didn't believe them before, but now I see, yeah, they really are abusive. We should support the rebels, and that's especially true if you have a rebel group trying for independence and creating their own country. At stage 3, violence starts to intensify. At stage 3, now you do start seeing people hurt, put in danger, and sometimes killed. When you've got significant fatalities at stage 3, well, that's how you know you're at stage 3. You start to see more and more acts, not just of violence, but killings. You know, if the violence still targets buildings and windows and objects that aren't alive, well, you might still be at stage 2. When you've got people being killed in significant numbers, you're definitely at stage 3. And that blame game continues and gets worse. Both sides blame each other for escalating the violence. Each side tries to convince people that they are right and it wouldn't be as violent and people wouldn't die if they'd just get their way and the other side would stop trying to impose their will on them. Both sides say that. Both sides blame the other. At this point, you can still avoid stage 4, the explosion stage, but it's hard to do that. When you get to stage 2, it's hard to stop it, but it's still fairly possible. At stage 3, still possible to stop things from exploding, but the odds against that go up, meaning it gets really difficult to avoid war at the situation. The only way it happens is both sides have to agree to sit down, to have peace talks, and actually come in with a mindset that, you know, I might have to compromise here, which means I'm not going to get my way with everything I want. And as you can imagine, that's tough. In our game, could you imagine the rebels and President Alexei doing that? Maybe you can, but the odds of that happening aren't all that high. I suppose it could have happened, but you probably would have bet that it wouldn't happen knowing those two sides rather than betting on that it would, which is why, if you're at stage 3, it is really hard to stop the explosion from happening. Also at stage 3, we certainly saw this during our game. You will see a major drop in the economy. A little drop, not a big deal. That doesn't show you at stage 3. You can have small drops in the economy at stage 1 or even stage 2. But when you start seeing significant drop-off, now you're in stage 3. This doesn't always happen, and there's a lot of reasons why it happens. And economics can be complex, so I'm not going to go in and get over my head with this explanation because I am not an economist. However, it is common, and here's why. It's because people are getting nervous about the future. And when people get nervous, they don't spend money. If it came out tomorrow that RSU2 was going to close the school and everybody who worked there would be out of a job, I'm not going to go out and buy a new car that night because I'm not sure what my future is. Can I get another job? Will I get another job that pays me as much as this job? What's going to happen? Can I pay my bills? That's what I'm concerned about. I got to pay my bills for my food, my clothing, and shelter, which means if I was planning on going on a trip, I'm not going to do that anymore, which means the money I was going to spend on that, to the airline, the travel agency, the hotel, the restaurants, that's not going to happen. Now, if it's just one person who does that, that's no big deal. But in a situation where your entire society is scared, everyone stops spending. And that's when the economy goes down, businesses suffer, people lose their jobs. And it's kind of a cyclical thing, meaning it moves in a circle. The more tense things are, the worse the economy is. But the worse the economy is, the more tense things are. And the more tense things are, the worse the economy is. It makes a bad situation even worse. Then you get to stage 4. If you can't avoid stage 4, if you can't solve it at stage 3, you get the explosion stage, which means the military is now being used to subdue and stop the rebel groups, and war is either here or almost here. Significant martial law. Anyone even thought of helping the rebels would find themselves arrested. The military takes control of the area and really rules very harshly. And usually that means there'll be some pushback and people will attack the military. You don't need a war to be at stage 4. However, usually you're either almost there, and I mean like a millimeter away, or you are there. The rebels usually respond in the situation at stage 4. If the government's going to crack down on them, the rebels will push back. And usually, since they're the smaller side, they're outnumbered, and they resort to what's called guerrilla tactics. Not guerrilla as in a giant lowland ape. Not that kind of guerrilla. You see it on your screen, the G-U-E-R, guerrilla. That's from the French word for war. And guerrilla tactics means it's the way you fight if you're the smaller side against a bigger side. Hit-and-run tactics, sneak attacks. You just fight dirty, and you don't engage or fight the enemy one-on-one with your full army against theirs. You'd never win that way. So you really try to fight in a way that plays to your advantage. You can't crush a bigger army doing that, but you can really weaken them and drag the war out and make it long. And that's the problem. If the military comes in and hopes the rebels are going to back down, and the rebels start doing that and they're successful, now things start to drag out and things take a lot longer. And a president, like Alexei in this case, might have been expecting that the army comes, the rebels back down, the whole thing's over in 3 weeks. Usually it doesn't go that way. Usually the rebels fight back, and weeks turn into months, and months turn into years. And that's how you get long wars coming out of this. Eventually, whether it's weeks, months, or years, the war will be over. Someone's going to win and someone's going to surrender. And when that happens, we do get to stage 5, resolution. Someone's won. The fighting has stopped. Now we have to kind of work things out. If the government wins, usually what happens is sometimes rebel leaders get executed and others are imprisoned. Now, not always. There are situations like the American Civil War when President Lincoln, before he was assassinated, said he didn't want this to end with hangings. He felt that hanging the rebel leaders would just make the South madder and lead to another war down the road. Other times, you do see executions, like at the end of World War II. War criminals were executed after the Nazis fell, and they were tried and given a trial, but the ones who were found guilty were executed. Some others went to jail. That wasn't a rebellion as much as it was a war between countries, but the same principle applies. Oftentimes, the winners decide, the losers forfeit their lives, or at least forfeit their freedom, and they're thrown in jail. The funny thing is, the same thing usually happens when the rebels win, except the government leaders often see that happen. The former leader of the country who loses, the head of the government, Alexei, I guess in our case, if they lost, or even us, if we sided with Alexei and we lost to the rebels, they might execute us. Or if we're lucky, they might just send us away in exile and say, all right, get out of here. You're no longer in control. We're not going to kill you, but you have to get out of our new country. Or maybe they'll throw us in jail. But one thing that will happen is the rebels, if they win, will form a brand new government with themselves in charge, doing things their way. But here's the catch. Remember the original problem? You have to solve it here at this resolution stage. Unless the original problem has been dealt with satisfactorily, you'll end up back at stage 2 again. For example, if the problem was the government's abusive, and the rebels win, and they form a new government, and Catalan becomes independent, and then they come up with a government that's just as abusive, well, all you're doing is creating new rebels, and the same thing starts again. Those new rebels, I guess the merchants as they were in our game, now they start to unite, and they start to use violence, and the same thing starts to happen. So there are some places in the world that are going through a perpetual rebellion, meaning it never ends. Yeah, you've got some ceasefires. You have an explosion, people fight, and the fighting stops, and someone, I guess, wins. But since the problem is not really solved, you just go back to stage 2, it develops, it accelerates, and explodes again. And there's another resolution, and it's not solved. You go back to stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. Unless it's solved, you'll just start over and over and over again. That pattern is followed all across the world. The American Revolution looked like this. The problem was solved for America. As you'll see, in the American Revolution, the problem was we felt England's government was abusive, so we kicked out England's government, formed a new one. That ended the problem, and there was no future rebellion here against the government at any large scale. There are a couple small ones we'll talk about later on. But the point being, basically, the big problem was solved, so America didn't have rebellion after rebellion for the next 20 or 30 years. But other places have seen that happen. The French Revolution is a great example. French Revolution, the rebels kicked out the king, but their government wasn't much better. And a guy named Napoleon and his friends came over and took over. They had 2 rebellions, and then Napoleon himself got ousted later on. France was very interesting for about 50 or 60 years in the late 1700s, early 1800s, as they kind of cycled through rebellion because the problem wasn't solved. They had a rebellion, but the original problem remained, and they kept going back through it over and over again. You can kind of picture that with Catalan. The one thing the game doesn't tell you is how things end. It might tell you there's a war, it might tell you who won the first battle, but it doesn't really tell you how things end. But unless the original problem was solved satisfactorily, it wouldn't end for very long. You just go back to the original problem, it would develop again, and 10, 15, 20 years down the road, you'll simply have a new fight because the old one really wasn't solved. You're going to see that as part of the questions I'm asking you, too. When you look at your assessment, one of the things you'll do is kind of create what you feel is going to happen in your class in Stage 5. How do you think this would have turned out here, realistically speaking? You'll see that when you get to the assessment. And you can start looking at that right now, in fact. It's on your classroom, Catalan and DeMock Revolution's 5 Stages Assessment. And as you'll see, I want you to kind of take the entire Catalan story from the part that I wrote all the way through the decisions in your game, which are there in your Google Classroom as well, and kind of figure out, all right, how did this play into the pattern? I want you to break the story down into the 5 stages. More information is on the classroom. When you click on the document, it will take you right through exactly what I want you to do, and that's what I want you to kind of work on and show me. When I get back to class, next time I see you, whether it's going to be on Friday or Monday, we'll talk about that assessment in more detail, and I'll help you work on it for that class day before we start moving on to the real revolution we want to cover, ours here in America. We have to start with a problem, and that's what we'll start with next week. That's all for this. Hope you enjoyed it. It's fairly short. I tried to keep it as short as I possibly could while still give a clear explanation. You can start working, and I'll see you next class.